Welcome to Mystic Sleep Tales, a place where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres guide you toward rest. Before tonight's story begins, you are warmly invited to share where you are listening from in the comments below. It is always a comfort to see this quiet community reaching across the world night by night. And if these stories bring you a sense of calm, you are welcome to subscribe and join us on these peaceful journeys. Now, take a moment to get comfortable, settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Gently close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and allow the day to soften and fade. Let my voice carry you quietly into sleep, to a place where imagination drifts and rest comes naturally. The people of Ashford had been coming to Samuel Hartwick's shop for 50 years. Not for the medicines on the shelves. Those were ordinary, the same tinctures and powders available at any chemist in the county: camphor for coughs, bicarbonate for indigestion, iodine for cuts, the standard repertoire of a village apothecary, dispensed with competence and without flair. The shop on Bridge Street looked like any other chemist's shop in any other English village in 1902. Glass jars in rows, a brass scale on the counter, a bell above the door that rang once when you entered and once when you left, marking your visit with the quiet precision of a mechanism that understood its single purpose and fulfilled it without complaint. They came for what Samuel mixed in the back room, behind the curtain, from the plants in the garden that no one was permitted to enter. Small brown bottles with handwritten labels that said things no proper pharmacist would write, for the mornings when getting up feels like a decision rather than a habit, for the conversations you did not have and now cannot, for the weight that sits behind the eyes on the first day of November. These bottles cost nothing. Samuel never charged for them. And they worked. That was the part no one could explain, and that everyone in Ashford had quietly agreed not to try. Clara Hartwick arrived in Ashford on a Thursday afternoon in late October, carrying a single bag and the particular expression of a woman who has travelled further than the miles suggest. She was 28 years old. She had studied botany at Cambridge for 3 years. Not a degree. Women were not awarded degrees. But she had attended the lectures and completed the examinations, and received a certificate that said she had demonstrated competence, which was the most the university was prepared to offer a woman in 1902, and which Clara had accepted with the grace of someone who understood that fighting certain battles required first surviving them. She had come by train from London, where she had been working as an assistant in a botanical library, cataloguing specimens, filing correspondence, performing the quiet, meticulous work of someone whose knowledge exceeded her position, but who had not yet found the context in which that knowledge could be fully used. The train had carried her westward through the English countryside, in its slow, considered way, past fields and farms and villages that grew smaller and quieter as London receded, as though the landscape were gradually exhaling, releasing the tension of the city mile by mile, until what remained was simply land and sky, and the particular piece of places that have never felt the need to be anything other than what they are. She had not been to Ashford in 5 years. The village had not changed, which was both a comfort and a reproach. The stone bridge over the river, the church with its square tower, the row of shops along Bridge Street, the houses climbing the hill behind them in tidy terraces, everything exactly where it had always been, everything doing exactly what it had always done, as though the village existed outside of time, or had come to an arrangement with time that exempted it from the usual requirements of change. The solicitor had written to her in September Samuel Hartwick had died on the 4th of August, peacefully, in the small bedroom above the shop, with the window open and the smell of the garden drifting up through the glass, the smell that Clara remembered from childhood visits, green and complex and faintly sweet, like something between lavender and rosemary, but neither, like a scent that had been composed rather than grown, arranged with intention, each note chosen for its contribution to the whole. Samuel had left her everything: the shop, the rooms above it, the stock on the shelves, the equipment in the back room, and the garden. Particularly the garden. The solicitor had mentioned this with a slight emphasis that suggested the garden was the point of the inheritance, the real thing being transmitted, and everything else was merely the frame around it. Clara walked down Bridge Street in the thin October light. The street was quiet at this hour, the afternoon lull between the business of the morning and the settling in of the evening, when shops stood with their doors half open and their keepers somewhere in the back, attending to the small tasks that fill the spaces between customers. The baker's was closed, its window showing the remnants of the morning's bread, a few brown loaves, a tray of buns, the particular emptiness of a shop that has sold most of what it made and is resting before tomorrow. The ironmonger's was open, its interior dark and dense with the shapes of tools and implements hanging from the ceiling and walls, a cave of useful things presided over by a man Clara could see dimly at the back, polishing something with a cloth. The butcher's had already pulled its shutters. The post office showed a light in the window. Samuel's shop was at the far end of Bridge Street, just before the bridge itself, the stone bridge that gave the street its name, a modest arch over a modest river that flowed without ambition through the centre of the village, supplying the ducks and the willows and the general atmosphere of rural tranquillity that Ashford had been producing for several hundred years without apparent effort. The shop was closed. It had been closed since August, the door locked, the windows dark, a small card in the glass reading, "Closed," until further notice in handwriting that was not Samuel's, but someone else's. Someone practical who had stepped in to do what needed doing when the person who usually did it was no longer available. The shop looked, Clara thought, like a face with its eyes closed, not dead, resting, waiting to be woken. She let herself in with the solicitor's key. The bell above the door rang once, a clear, bright sound in the empty shop, startling in its ordinariness, as though the shop had not registered that anything had changed and was greeting her the way it greeted everyone, with a single reliable note of acknowledgement. The smell inside was of medicines and dust and wood polish, and beneath everything, very faintly, the garden. The front room was exactly as she remembered. The glass jars in their rows, each one labelled in Samuel's careful hand, the brass scale on the counter with its set of weights in their velvet-lined box, the wooden cabinets with their many small drawers, each drawer labelled, each containing something specific and known. The order of it was Samuel, that meticulous, unhurried precision that he had brought to everything he touched, the conviction that things had places and that placing them correctly was not fussiness but respect. Clara moved through the shop slowly, running her fingers along the counter, touching the jars, opening a drawer and closing it again. The smells rose and subsided as she moved: camphor, clove, dried mint, the sharp, clean scent of alcohol, the deeper, warmer smell of beeswax. She had played here as a child, sitting on the floor behind the counter while Samuel served customers, listening to the conversations without understanding them, absorbing the rhythm of the shop, the bell, the greeting, the quiet consultation, the retreating footsteps, the bell again. She reached the curtain at the back of the shop. Heavy, dark green velvet hung from a brass rail. Behind this curtain was the back room, Samuel's real workspace, the place where the brown bottles were mixed, the place no customer ever entered. The place Clara herself had been permitted to visit only twice, both times as a child, both times briefly, both times leaving with the impression of having seen something she was not yet ready to understand. She pulled the curtain aside. The back room was smaller than she remembered, or she was larger, which amounted to the same thing. A long wooden workbench ran along one wall, its surface stained with 50 years of tinctures and infusions, the wood darkened and smooth. Above the bench, shelves held bottles of every size, some clear, some amber, some dark blue, each one containing a liquid of a different color, from palest gold to deepest green to a brown so dark it was nearly black. Beneath the bench, wooden crates held dried plants bundled and labeled, their scents mingling into something rich and layered, and impossible to separate into individual notes. At the far end of the bench, a mortar and pestle, large marble, the interior of the mortar worn smooth by decades of grinding. Beside it, a set of brass measuring spoons, and a glass funnel, and a stack of the small brown bottles that Clara remembered. The bottles with the handwritten labels, the bottles that the people of Ashford came for, the bottles that cost nothing and worked in ways that no one could explain. And on the wall above the bench, a key, a single iron key hanging on a nail, labeled in Samuel's hand, "The Garden." Clara took the key. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, its age, the particular smoothness of iron that has been handled many times by the same hand. Then she walked to the back door of the shop, the door that opened onto the cobbled yard, and beyond the yard, the wooden gate in the high stone wall that separated the shop from whatever lay behind it. The yard was small and bare, cobblestones, a rain barrel, a stack of empty crates, nothing remarkable, but the wall was remarkable. 8 feet high, built of local stone, topped with a layer of moss so thick and green it looked deliberate, as though someone had planted it there as a finishing touch. The wall enclosed something. Clara could feel it, not see it, feel it. A presence behind the wall, a warmth, a density of growing things pressing against the stone, filling the space within, producing the smell that reached her even here, even on this side of the gate, even through the old wood and the ancient stone. She put the key in the lock. It turned without resistance, as though it had been expecting her, as though the gate had been waiting to be opened by this particular hand at this particular time. She pushed the gate open and stepped into her grandfather's garden. The garden was not large, perhaps 40 feet by 60, enclosed on all 4 sides by the high stone wall. But it was full in the way that a library is full, every inch of space occupied with intention, every plant placed precisely where it needed to be, every relationship between one plant and its neighbor considered and calibrated with the attention of someone who understood that growing things live in communities, and that the health of each depends on the character of all. Clara stood in the gateway and looked. The beds were arranged in a pattern she did not immediately recognize, not the formal geometry of a Victorian kitchen garden, not the controlled wildness of a cottage garden, something else, entirely. Curved beds, flowing into one another like the channels of a river delta, separated by narrow paths of crushed stone, that wound through the space in a way that invited walking, but not hurrying. The paths curved and doubled back on themselves, so that walking through the garden became a kind of meditation, a slow spiral inward toward the center, where a single stone bench sat beneath the branches of a tree Clara could not identify. A small tree, not much taller than the wall, with dark leaves and pale bark, its branches spreading in a wide, sheltering canopy that created beneath it a space of particular stillness. The plants themselves were extraordinary, not because of their size or their color, though both were remarkable, but because Clara, who had spent 3 years studying botany at Cambridge, who had memorized the classification systems and the Latin names and the identifying characteristics of hundreds of species, could not identify a single one. Not one. She walked forward slowly along the first curved path, looking left and right at the beds on either side. The plants were healthy, vigorously, exuberantly healthy, the kind of health that suggests not just adequate care but perfect conditions, each plant growing exactly as it was meant to grow, without struggle, without compromise. She saw tall stems with blue flowers she had never encountered in any textbook, low creeping vines with leaves of a green so deep it was almost black, spreading along the south wall with quiet confidence, small white blooms on delicate stems that seemed to lean toward her as she passed, as though they were aware of her presence, as though they were curious. She crouched beside one of the plants, the blue-flowered one in the eastern bed, and examined it closely. The stem was sturdy, slightly woody at the base, with fine hairs along its length. The leaves were opposite, ovate, with serrated edges and a silvery underside that caught the light when the breeze moved them, flashing briefly like small mirrors. The flowers were 5-petaled, a deep, saturated blue that Clara had never seen in any flowering plant, not the pale blue of borage, not the purple blue of lavender, not the bright blue of cornflowers, a blue that existed nowhere in her botanical vocabulary. A blue she had no name for. She leaned closer and breathed in. The scent was faint but distinct, something between rain on warm stone and the smell of a library in the morning. Old paper and quiet purpose. She reached for the flower instinctively, the way a botanist reaches for a specimen, to examine it, to catalogue it, to bring it within the systems of understanding she had been trained to apply. But her hand stopped before it touched the petals, not because she decided to stop, because stopping felt correct. The flower was not asking to be examined. It was asking to be noticed. There was a difference, and Clara felt it without being able to articulate it. The difference between observation that takes and attention that gives. Beside the plant, a small wooden stake was pressed into the soil. On it, in Samuel's handwriting, that small, precise hand she knew as well as her own, a single word: forgiveness. Clara straightened and looked at the next plant. Another stake, another word: patience. And the next: belonging. And the next: the courage to begin again. She walked the entire garden, reading the stakes. Every plant had one. Every label was in Samuel's hand, and every label was not a name but a quality, an emotion, a condition of the human heart. Grief observed from a great distance, the particular loneliness of knowing the answer and not being asked the question, the warmth of a room you have just entered after a long time away, contentment without reason. Clara stood in the center of the garden beside the stone bench beneath the unidentifiable tree, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, not since childhood, perhaps not since the last time she had been in this garden, sitting on this bench while Samuel worked among his plants, speaking to them in a low voice, as one speaks to old friends whose company requires no performance. She felt wonder. Not the intellectual wonder of discovery, the kind she had learned to value at Cambridge, the satisfaction of understanding a system or classifying a specimen. A different kind of wonder, the wonder of standing in the presence of something that refuses to be classified, that exists outside the systems you have learned, that simply is, without apology, without explanation. She sat on the bench. The stone was warm, warmer than it should have been on an October afternoon, warmer than stone had any right to be when the sun was thin and the air was cool, and the season was turning toward winter. She placed her palms flat on the surface and felt the warmth enter her hands and travel up her arms and settle somewhere in her chest. A slow, spreading comfort, like drinking something warm on a cold day, like being told something kind by someone who means it. Like coming home after a long journey and finding that home has not changed, has not moved, has been waiting exactly where you left it, with the patience of things that understand that waiting is not passive, but an active form of faith. She thought, this is what it feels like. This is what the people of Ashford came for, not the brown bottles. This, the garden itself, the warmth of it, the peace, the particular quality of being in a place where every growing thing has been tended with a kind of attention that does not judge or measure or classify, but simply notices, simply says, I see you. I know you are here. You are not alone. A blackbird landed on the wall and regarded her with one bright eye, tilting its head at the angle blackbirds adopt when they are deciding whether a situation requires their involvement. It decided it did not, and flew away, disappearing over the wall into the world outside the garden, the ordinary world where plants had Latin names and grew according to systems, and could be explained. Clara watched it go, and felt, for the first time since arriving in Ashford, something that might have been amusement, or might have been affection, or might have been the beginning of the understanding that Samuel's notebooks would eventually make complete. She sat for a long time. The garden was very quiet, not silent. Gardens are never silent. There was the sound of a bee somewhere in the blue flowers, the faint rustle of leaves adjusting to a breeze too slight to feel, the distant trickle of water from a source she could not see. But the quiet was of a particular quality. It was the quiet of a place that has been tended with attention for 50 years, a place where every sound is familiar and welcome and part of the whole, where nothing is out of place and nothing is missing, and the only thing required of you is to be present. She went inside eventually. The afternoon was fading, October light draining from the sky in its particular way, not gradually, but in stages, as though the day were a series of rooms, and the doors between them were closing one by one. She locked the garden gate behind her and stood for a moment in the cobbled yard, the key in her hand, the smell of the garden still in her lungs, still in her clothes, still in her hair. She would carry the smell with her for the rest of the evening, she knew. It would be in the bedroom when she lay down to sleep. It would be in her dreams, if she dreamed. The garden, once entered, did not easily let go of the person who had entered it. It followed you. It accompanied you, not intrusively, gently, the way a scent accompanies you from a room you have left, fading slowly, never quite disappearing. She went upstairs. Samuel's rooms above the shop were small and clean and arranged with the same meticulous care as the shop below. A sitting room with a single armchair by the fireplace, well worn. the cushion compressed into the shape of a man who had sat in the same position for 50 years, reading by lamplight, thinking about plants and people and the mysterious territory where the two overlapped. A small bookcase held volumes on botany, chemistry, herbalism, and, Clara noticed with surprise, poetry. Keats, Wordsworth, Tennyson. She had not known Samuel read poetry. She pulled out the Keats and opened it at random, and found a passage underlined in pencil. Beauty is truth, truth beauty. Beside it, in Samuel's hand, a note in the margin, also applicable to comfrey. Clara smiled. She replaced the book. A table with a lamp stood beside the armchair. A bedroom beyond, the bed made, the window facing the garden. She could see it from here, the green of it, the wall of it, the tree at the center spreading its dark canopy. And on the bedside table, beside the lamp, a stack of notebooks. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and picked up the first notebook, dark brown leather, soft with handling. The year on the cover, 1852. The year Samuel had come to Ashford. The year he had planted the garden. She opened it. April the 14th, 1852. I have arrived in Ashford. The shop is adequate, small but well positioned on Bridge Street, with good traffic and reasonable storage. The rooms above are comfortable enough. But the garden is the reason I have come. The space behind the shop, 40 feet by 60, enclosed by a stone wall that is at least 100 years old and still sound, is perfect. The soil is good. The aspect is correct. The wall provides shelter from the north wind and holds warmth from the south sun. I can begin. Clara turned the pages slowly. Samuel's voice emerged from the notebooks with the same quality it had carried in life. Calm, precise, attentive to detail, finding in the mundane the seeds of the extraordinary. May the 2nd, 1852. The first plantings are in. I brought the seeds from my teacher's garden in Somerset, the last of the collection he entrusted to me before he died. He told me that the plants would not grow from instructions. They would grow from attention. I asked him what the difference was. He said, "Instructions tell you what to do. Attention tells you what is needed. The difference is the direction of the listening." June the 19th, 1852. 3 of the plantings have taken. The blue-flowered one, I have not named it yet, naming feels premature, is the strongest. It established itself within 2 weeks and is already showing secondary growth. I have placed it in the eastern bed where the morning light is strongest. I have a sense, not yet confirmed, that this plant responds to the quality of attention it receives. When I sit beside it and observe it properly, not glancing, not checking, but truly observing, it seems to grow more vigorously. I note this without drawing conclusions. Clara read through the first year, and into the second and third. The garden grew. Samuel documented each plant with the thoroughness of a trained scientist and the sensitivity of a poet. He recorded not only the physical characteristics, height, leaf shape, flowering time, soil preferences, but something else as well, something he called, in the early notebooks, the quality of each plant. November the 15th, 1853. The first frost came last night. I was concerned for the newer plantings, but I need not have been. Every plant in the garden has survived without damage. This is not remarkable for the hardier species, but several of the plants are, or should be, frost-sensitive. They show no sign of distress. The garden, it seems, maintains its own temperature. I measured it this morning with a thermometer placed at soil level, 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The air temperature outside the garden wall, 31 degrees. A difference of 17 degrees that I cannot account for by the shelter of the walls alone. Something else is at work. The garden is warming itself. August the 2nd, 1854. I have begun to notice a pattern in the visits. The people who come to the back room, for the brown bottles, for the remedies that are not remedies in any conventional sense, come in clusters, 3 or 4 in a week, then none for a month. The clusters correspond, I have realized, to the garden's own rhythms. When a particular plant is at its peak, when the blue flowers are deepest, or the vine is putting out new growth, the people who need what that plant offers appear at the door, as though the garden sends a signal I cannot hear, but they can, as though the growing of a particular quality of attention creates a need for that quality in the surrounding world, or reveals a need that was already there. March the 8th, 1854. The creeping vine along the south wall has reached the corner. Its growth rate has been steady, approximately 2 inches per week, but what interests me more than the rate is the character of the growth. This vine does not hurry. Other climbing plants I have observed seem impatient, reaching for the next handhold, scrambling upward with a kind of vegetable urgency. This vine advances with deliberation. Each new tendril appears to consider its direction before committing. I have begun to think of it as patience, not metaphorically. Literally, I believe this plant embodies patience the way a stone embodies hardness. It is not a description of the plant, but a property of it. September the 21st, 1855. A woman came to the shop today, Mrs. Alderman, the baker's wife. She did not come for camphor or iodine. She came because she had heard from Mrs. Pike that I could help with difficulties of a less physical nature. I asked her what difficulty she was experiencing. She said, "I cannot forgive my sister." She said this plainly, without drama, the way one states a fact about the weather. I cannot forgive my sister. I have tried. I cannot. I took her to the back room. I prepared a tincture from the blue-flowered plant in the eastern bed, the one I have been calling forgiveness, though I do not yet understand why. I gave it to her in a small brown bottle. I did not charge her. She returned a week later and said, "I have not forgiven my sister," but the weight of not forgiving her has become lighter. She seemed satisfied with this. I was satisfied too. I had not promised forgiveness. I had offered the plant. What the plant offered was its own business. Clara smiled at this, quietly to herself, in the darkening bedroom, with the notebook in her hands and the October evening settling around the house. Samuel's particular humor, dry, understated, arriving without announcement. What the plant offered was its own business. She read on. The notebooks chronicled 50 years of the garden and the shop and the village, intertwined and inseparable. The plants grew, the people came. Samuel documented both with equal attention the behavior of a particular species in an unusually wet spring, the troubles of a particular family in an unusually hard winter, the way both responded to care, to patience, to the particular kind of attention that does not seek to fix, but simply to be present. April the 12th, 1863. Young William Marsh came today, 12 years old. Lost his mother in February. He did not speak. He stood in the shop and held his cap in his hands and looked at the floor and did not speak. I did not ask him to speak. I brought him through to the back room and made him a cup of chamomile, ordinary chamomile, from the ordinary jar on the ordinary shelf, and I sat with him while he drank it. After 20 minutes he said, "The house smells different now." I said, "Houses change when people leave them." He said, "Will it change back?" I said, "Not back. Forward." He considered this. I gave him a bottle from the small white flowers, the ones I call homecoming. I did not explain what it was. He came back a month later and said, "The house still smells different, but I am learning the new smell." This seemed to me as much as anyone could ask. January the 5th, 1867. Thomas Beach came today, 15 years old, quiet, the kind of boy who stands at the edges of rooms. He did not ask for anything. He stood in the shop and looked at the jars and did not speak. I let him stand. After 20 minutes he said, "I do not know what is wrong with me." I said, "Perhaps nothing is wrong with you. Perhaps you are simply becoming yourself, and the process is uncomfortable." He looked at me as though I had said something either very wise or very foolish, and could not determine which. I made him a tincture from the small white flower that opens at dusk, the one I call homecoming. I told him to take it before bed. He returned a month later and said, "I am still uncomfortable, but I am less afraid of the discomfort." This seemed to me an excellent outcome. October the 10th, 1879. I am 53 years old today. The garden is 27. I have been thinking about what my teacher told me, that the plants would grow from attention, not instruction. I understand this now in a way I did not then. Attention is not observation. Observation keeps its distance. Attention enters the space. When I sit in the garden and attend to the plants, I am not watching them from outside. I am with them. I am part of the growing. I do not understand how this works. I do not need to understand. The plants understand. That is sufficient. Clara closed the notebook and opened the next. The years advanced. Samuel's observations grew more nuanced, more layered. He began to notice connections between the plants, how certain species grew better when placed beside certain others, how the garden as a whole responded to the seasons, not just in the expected ways of growth and dormancy, but in what Samuel called mood. April the 2nd, 1885. The garden is restless today. I cannot explain this in scientific terms, but I have been tending this space for 33 years, and I know its moods the way one knows the moods of a person one has lived with for a long time. Today the garden is restless. The plants are leaning toward the light more aggressively than usual. The vine on the south wall has put out 3 new tendrils overnight. The blue flowers are a shade deeper than yesterday. Something is arriving. I do not know what, but the garden knows, and the garden is preparing. April the 5th, 1885. Clara was born. My son's daughter. I received the telegram this morning. The garden today is calm. The restlessness of 3 days ago has resolved into a kind of settled satisfaction, the way a house feels after guests have arrived and been made comfortable. I do not claim that the garden knew. I merely note the coincidence and move on. Clara read this entry and felt tears arrive without warning, not dramatically, not with sobs, simply present, the way rain is sometimes present without thunder, without wind, falling quietly from a sky that does not appear to be crying. Samuel had noted her birth. The garden had prepared for it. She did not know what to do with this information. She held it the way one holds something offered by a stranger, carefully, without assumption, allowing it to be what it was before deciding what it meant. She read through the night. The lamp beside the bed burned steadily. The house was quiet around her, the shop below dark and closed, the garden beyond the wall invisible in the October darkness, but present, always present, its smell reaching her through the open window, green and complex and sweet and warm. The middle notebooks, the 1870s and 1880s, contained Samuel's most detailed observations of the plants themselves. He had developed his own system of classification, one that bore no resemblance to Linnaeus or any other taxonomic framework Clara had studied. He classified the plants not by their physical characteristics, but by what he called their offering, the particular quality of attention each plant embodied and could transmit to the person who received its tincture. December the 9th, 1876. I have been working on a catalogue of the garden's offerings, not a scientific catalogue. Science has no framework for what these plants do, and I have long since stopped trying to force them into one. A practical catalogue, a record of what each plant offers and who it tends to help. The blue flowers, forgiveness, particularly the kind that has been deferred for years. The vine, patience, particularly in situations where the outcome cannot be controlled. The white flowers that open at dusk, the sense of returning to oneself after a long absence, of being welcomed back into one's own life. The tall purple stems by the north wall, the courage required not to act, which is different from inaction and far more difficult. The low golden ground cover in the western bed, gratitude that arrives without reason, without provocation, simply because the capacity for it has been restored. February the 14th, 1878. Mrs. Pike came today with her daughter, who is 17, and who has not spoken since the autumn. Not cannot speak, will not. The distinction is important, and Mrs. Pike understands it, which is why she came to me, rather than to the doctor. I prepared a tincture from the small yellow flowers that grow beneath the tree, the ones I have labeled the permission to be incomplete. I gave it to the girl directly, looking at her while I did so, not through her, not past her, at her, in the way the garden has taught me to look at things. She took the bottle. She did not speak. She came back alone 2 weeks later and said, one word, thank you. Mrs. Pike tells me she has resumed speaking, though not as much as before. I consider this an improvement. Fewer words, chosen with more care, is not a deficit. It is a refinement. Clara closed another notebook. She had lost count of which year she was in. The hours had blurred together, the way hours do when you are absorbed in something that has its own pace, its own gravity, pulling you forward, not with suspense, but with the simple desire to know more, to understand more, to sit a little longer with someone's voice and let it teach you what it has to teach. The final notebook was different from the others. The leather was newer, not the worn, softened covers of the earlier volumes, but something stiffer, more recent, as though Samuel had started this notebook knowing it would be his last, and had chosen its materials accordingly. The year on the cover was 1901. The entries began in January and ended in July, 1 month before his death. Clara opened it in the morning. She had slept, not long, not deeply, but she had slept, and had woken to the particular grey-gold light of an October morning in the Cotswolds, the sun not yet visible above the hill, but its warmth already present in the air. the way a thought is present before it becomes a word. She made tea in Samuel's kitchen, using his kettle and his teapot, and the tea caddy she found in the cupboard labelled "Tea in Samuel's hand," as though there were any danger of confusing it with the caddy labelled "Chamomile" beside it, or the one labelled "For Sleeplessness" on the shelf above. She carried the tea upstairs and sat on the bed and opened the last notebook. January the 12th, 1901. I am 75 years old. The garden is 49. We are both, I think, approaching our final form, the shape we were always going to be, stripped of the unnecessary, refined to the essential. The blue flowers have never been so blue. The vine has reached the full extent of the south wall and has stopped, apparently satisfied. The tree at the center, which I have never named, which has never asked to be named, is larger than it has ever been, its canopy now covering the bench entirely, creating beneath it a space that I can only describe as complete. March the 3rd, 1901. I have been thinking about Clara. She will come here, I believe, after I am gone. She will find the garden, and the notebooks, and the shop, and the brown bottles, and she will try to understand. She was always a girl who tried to understand, who believed that understanding was the highest form of respect one could pay to a thing. I loved this about her. I also worried about it, because some things resist understanding, not because they are beyond comprehension, but because they are beyond language. The garden is such a thing. It can be experienced, it can be tended, it cannot be explained. I hope Clara will forgive me for leaving her something inexplicable. I hope she will see that the inexplicable is not a failure of the giver, but a gift of a different kind. Clara read this slowly. She read it twice. She held the notebook in her lap and looked out the window at the garden below. Visible now in the morning light, the green of it extraordinary against the grey stone of the walls, the tree at the centre spreading its dark canopy over the bench, the paths curving through the beds like the lines of a map of somewhere she was only beginning to learn. May the 17th, 1901. Mrs. Alderman came again today. She is 81. She has been coming to the shop for 46 years. She did not need a bottle. She came to sit in the shop and talk, which is a different kind of medicine and one I have never charged for either. She told me that her sister died last spring. She told me that they had reconciled years ago and had spent the last 20 years in what she called comfortable peace. She thanked me for the blue tincture. I told her the tincture did not create the forgiveness. It merely made the weight of not forgiving lighter, which gave her room to find forgiveness on her own. She considered this and said, "That is the same thing." I considered this and decided she was right. June the 29th, 1901. The garden has begun to do something I have not seen before. The plants are producing seeds, not in the ordinary way. Most of these plants have never produced seeds in all the years I have tended them. They have grown vegetatively, spreading through roots and runners and cuttings that I have taken and propagated over the decades. But now, this summer, seeds, dozens of them, small, dark, perfectly formed, appearing in the seed heads of plants that have never had seed heads before. I am collecting them. I am placing them in labelled envelopes in the workbench drawer. I believe the garden is preparing for a transfer. I believe it knows what I know, that this is the last summer, and it is ensuring that what it has grown will not be lost. July the 14th, 1901. I spent today cataloguing the seeds. Each envelope is labelled with the plant's offering, not its name, It has no name, but the quality it embodies: forgiveness, patience, homecoming, the courage to begin again, contentment without reason, the permission to be incomplete. 47 envelopes in total, 47 qualities of attention, preserved in seed form, waiting to be planted by whoever comes next. The garden has been thorough. It has left nothing out. July the 20th, 1901. A warm evening. I sat in the garden until the light was almost gone. The small white flowers opened at dusk, as they always do, not all at once, but one by one, as though each flower needed to make its own decision about the moment. I have watched this opening hundreds of times, and it has never ceased to be beautiful. The particular beauty of things that happen without audience, without applause, simply because it is their nature to happen. The flowers open because opening is what they do. They do not require my observation to justify it, but I observe anyway, because observation is what I do. And perhaps I think this now, at 75, more clearly than I have ever thought it. Perhaps that is the entire point. Two things doing what they do, side by side, each one making the other more itself. The flower more fully a flower for being observed, the observer more fully himself for having something to observe, the relationship itself, the thing that grows. Clara set the notebook down. She went downstairs, through the shop, through the back room, into the cobbled yard. She unlocked the garden gate. She stepped inside. The October morning was cool, but the garden was warm. That same impossible warmth she had felt yesterday, radiating from the soil, from the stone bench, from the air itself, as though the garden generated its own heat, its own season, independent of the calendar and the weather and the expectations of the rational mind. She walked the paths slowly, reading the labels, touching the plants, gently, with the tips of her fingers, the way Samuel had touched them, with attention rather than grip, with presence rather than pressure. She reached the tree at the center. She sat on the bench. The warmth rose through the stone into her body, through her legs, her spine, her shoulders, settling into her like something finding its home. Above her, the dark leaves of the tree moved slightly in a breeze she could not feel, making small sounds that were not quite rustling, more like whispering, more like the faintest possible conversation between the leaves and the air, a conversation that had been going on for 49 years and would continue for as long as there was someone to sit beneath the tree and listen. She returned to the notebook. The final entry. July the 27th, 1901. I have spent today in the garden, all day from sunrise to the evening. I sat on the bench. I did not tend, I did not weed, or water, or prune, or mix. I simply sat and attended. The garden attended back. That is the only way I can describe it. A mutual attending, a shared noticing, two beings who have lived together for 49 years, acknowledging that the arrangement has been good. The seeds are in the drawer. The notebooks are on the shelf. The key is on the wall. Whoever comes next, Clara, I hope, but whoever comes, will find everything in its place. The garden will teach them what it taught me, in its own time, in its own way, not through instruction, through attention. I have not always known what I was growing. I planted seeds my teacher gave me, seeds he himself had received from his teacher, and before that, from a line of gardeners going back further than anyone now remembers. I did not know what would grow. I knew only that the growing mattered, that the act of tending these particular plants in this particular way produced something the world needed, even if the world did not know it needed it, even if the world could not name what it was receiving. I know what it is now. I have known for some time, though I have not written it until this moment, because writing it felt like finishing, and finishing felt like leaving, and I was not ready to leave. The garden grows remedies, but not for the body. For the parts of a person that have no name in medical science, the parts that ache without injury, that break without fracture, that heal without treatment, but only if someone notices that they are hurt. The garden grows attention itself. Distilled, concentrated, made physical in the form of leaves and stems and flowers and roots. Each plant is a particular quality of attention. Forgiveness is the attention paid to a wound that has been carried too long. Patience is the attention paid to something that is not yet ready. Homecoming is the attention paid to the self you forgot you were. Clara will understand this. Not immediately. Not through the notebooks. She will understand it the way I understood it, by sitting in the garden, by tending the plants, by allowing the attention of the garden to enter her the way sunlight enters a room. Not by force, not by invitation, simply by being present when the light arrives. The light is arriving now. The evening light, the October light I have always loved best, low and amber and warm, coming through the garden in long horizontal bands that turn the leaves to gold and the stone wall to honey, and the whole small enclosed world of this garden into something luminous and sufficient, and exactly, precisely, entirely itself. I am grateful. That is the last thing I wish to record. 50 years of notes and observations and measurements, and this is what remains when everything else is set aside. Gratitude for the garden, for the plants, for the people who came and trusted and left a little lighter, for Clara, who will come, for the attention itself, given and received, offered and accepted, the simplest and most difficult thing a person can do. The seeds are in the drawer. The garden will continue. Good. Clara closed the notebook. She held it in her lap for a long time, the way one holds something that has completed itself, that has said everything it needed to say. The morning light was strengthening through the window. The garden was visible below, green and warm and quietly alive, the paths winding through the beds, the tree at the center spreading its canopy, the bench beneath it, waiting. She went downstairs. She went through the shop, past the glass jars and the brass scale, and the bell that did not ring, because she did not open the door. She went through the back room, past the workbench with its 50 years of stains, past the mortar and pestle, past the shelves of bottles. She pulled open the drawer beneath the workbench. Inside, exactly as Samuel had described, envelopes, dozens of them, each one labeled in Samuel's hand. Seeds, dark and small and perfectly formed, each one a particular quality of attention, waiting to be planted, waiting to grow. She took the envelopes and carried them to the garden. She unlocked the gate. She stepped through. The warmth received her. Clara stood in the garden on an October morning and looked at the beds that Samuel had tended for 50 years, at the blue flowers in the eastern bed, at the patient vine along the south wall, at the small white blooms that opened at dusk, at all the unnamed, unclassifiable, impossible plants that grew here in defiance of every botanical system she had ever learned. She understood then, not with her mind, not with the part of her that had studied at Cambridge and learned the Latin names and memorized the classification systems. She understood with the part of her that had sat on this bench as a child and felt the warmth rise through the stone, and had known, without words, without concepts, that something here was true, Something here was real. Something here was growing that the world needed, even if the world did not know it needed it, even if no one could explain what it was. She knelt beside the eastern bed. She opened one of the envelopes. The seeds inside were small and dark and warm in her palm, warmer than they should have been, warmer than seeds kept in a drawer in a back room had any reason to be, as though they carried their own heat, their own readiness, the concentrated warmth of 50 years of attention stored in a space no larger than a grain of pepper. She pressed them into the soil with her fingers, gently, with attention, with the particular care of someone beginning something they intend to continue for a very long time. The soil was soft and dark and ready. It received the seeds the way it had received every seed for 50 years, without question, without resistance, with the quiet confidence of ground that knows exactly what it is for. Clara felt the soil close around the seeds as she covered them, felt the warmth of the ground against her fingertips, felt something pass between her hand and the earth that was not physical, not measurable, not anything she could have described in the language she had learned at Cambridge. It was attention, her attention, moving through her fingers into the soil, meeting the garden's attention which rose to receive it the way a hand rises to meet another hand. She planted more seeds, one envelope after another, moving along the eastern bed, then the southern bed, then the western bed. Each envelope labeled with a quality she was only beginning to understand, not intellectually, not through analysis, but through the simple act of kneeling in the dirt and pressing seeds into the ground and feeling the garden respond. Forgiveness went into the eastern bed, where the morning light was strongest. Patience went along the south wall, where the vine had already demonstrated its meaning for 49 years. The courage to begin again went into a new bed Clara cleared near the gate, a bed that had not existed before, that she created with her hands, pulling the weeds and turning the soil and preparing a space for something that had not yet grown, but would. Clara planted. The garden watched. The October light fell through the space in long amber bands, turning everything it touched to gold. The stone wall, the dark leaves of the tree, the soil beneath her fingers, the woman kneeling in the garden beginning. She would learn the rest in time. She would learn which plants needed morning light and which preferred shade. She would learn the rhythm of the watering, the timing of the pruning, the particular way the garden communicated its needs, not in words, not in any language she had been taught, but in the language of attention, the language of noticing, the language that Samuel had spent 50 years learning and had left for her in 50 notebooks and a drawer full of seeds. She would open the shop again. She would mix the tinctures in the back room. She would write labels on the small brown bottles for the weight that sits behind the eyes, for the conversations you did not have and now cannot, for the mornings when getting up feels like a decision rather than a habit. She would give them away, as Samuel had, without charge, without explanation, trusting the garden to do what the garden had always done, which was to grow what was needed and offer it to whoever came through the door. She would learn the names the garden gave its plants, not Latin names, not the names of science, but the names of experience, forgiveness, patience, homecoming, the courage to begin again. She would learn that these names were more accurate than anything Linnaeus had ever devised, because they described not what a plant was, but what a plant did, not its structure, but its purpose, not its classification, but its gift. She would sit on the stone bench in every season and feel the warmth rise through the stone, and she would understand, eventually, that the warmth was not heat, but attention. The accumulated attention of 50 years of a man sitting in the same place and noticing the same things and finding them, every time, worthy of notice. Attention stored in stone the way honey stores sunlight. Attention that did not fade because it had been given honestly, without expectation, without agenda, simply because the giving was the point. But that was later. Now she knelt in the soil and planted seeds and felt the warmth of the garden around her and the October light on her back and the faint, complex, sweet green smell of 50 years of growing things. And she thought, this is attention. This is what it feels like, and this is enough. The garden held its warmth. The tree at the center spread its dark canopy over the bench where Samuel had sat for 50 years, and where Clara would sit for many years to come, through winters and springs and summers and autumns, through mornings of frost and afternoons of rain, and evenings of that particular amber light that turned the garden to gold. The stone walls enclosed the space the way arms enclose a sleeping child, not tightly, not loosely, but exactly enough. The blue flowers stood in their bed, their color deeper than any blue Clara had ever seen, deeper than language, deeper than naming, the particular impossible blue of something that has decided to be beautiful and sees no reason to be anything else. Beyond the garden wall, the village of Ashford continued its quiet afternoon. Smoke rose from chimneys. The river flowed beneath its bridge. The baker's wife swept her step. The ironmonger closed his shutters. The post office lamp burned on. Ordinary life, proceeding at its ordinary pace. In an ordinary English village, where an extraordinary garden grew behind an ordinary wall, tended by ordinary people who understood that the most extraordinary thing a person can do is pay attention, truly, fully, without reservation, to the living things that share the world with them. And in the back room of the shop, on the workbench, Samuel's mortar and pestle waited. Marble, worn smooth by 50 years of grinding, of combining, of making remedies for the parts of people that had no name. It would be used again. The marble was patient. The marble understood that some things take time, and that waiting is not emptiness, but preparation, and that the person who would next pick up the pestle and begin to grind was already here, already kneeling in the garden, already learning the language of attention that the plants had always spoken, and that Samuel had spent his life translating into small brown bottles with handwritten labels, and no price, because some things cannot be sold, only given, only tended, only grown. Upstairs, the notebooks sat on the bedside table in their stack of 50 years of observation, 50 years of a man's careful attention to a garden that defied every system of classification and rewarded every moment of genuine looking. Clara would read them all, in time. She would read them slowly, the way Samuel had written them, one season at a time, one entry at a time, allowing each observation to settle before moving to the next. She would find in them not just a record of a garden, but a record of a way of being in the world, attentive, patient, generous, precise, a way of looking at things that made the things themselves more real, a way of tending that was, in the end, indistinguishable from love. The October afternoon deepened. The light turned gold, then amber, then the particular warm rose of an English autumn sunset, and the garden glowed, and the shop was quiet, and the bell above the door waited for the morning when it would ring again once, clearly, as it always had, marking the arrival of someone who needed something they could not name and finding, on the other side of the counter, someone who could not name it either, but who had a garden, and a drawer full of seeds, and all the time in the world.